Welcome to Season 5 of SEL in EDU. This is a space for educators who believe social emotional learning isn't an add-on. It's part of how we teach, lead, and show up every day. I'm Dr. Krista, and in each episode, we'll explore real stories, practical strategies, and the human side of learning that helps schools grow with intention. Today, I have two guests with me. Stephanie Clinise, a secondary ELA teacher who had been on before talking about AI in education, and Erika Schwanbeck, a restorative practice coach. Here's the idea that reframed it for me. Restorative practice should be 80% proactive. Most of the work happens before any conflict, not after. We talk about what that looks like in a real classroom, circles, shared language, and all. Here's my conversation with Stephanie and Erika. Welcome back, SEL and EDU. I'm incredibly excited to also have Stephanie Clinise back on again. You probably heard her original podcast interview where she talked about AI in her classroom. When Stephanie and I were first talking, you need to meet my friend Erika. In her classroom, they actually go through the process of restorative practices on a day-to-day basis. And I love this, and I thought we need to have both of you, Stephanie and Erika, come back on again because we often talk about social emotional learning and the skills that students need to develop. But students develop those skills within a context. They need the conditions to practice those skills. And we've heard restorative practices has gotten to be very popular. I know it in theory, but I'm not a practitioner. And so I'm so excited to have Erika and Stephanie here to talk about what this looks like day to day. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. And I just want to give you a quick shout out. You absolutely are a practitioner of restorative practices, whether or not you realize it in the way that you carry yourself. So you're already on the path.
Thank you. I think that's important to note and to think about because sometimes we get in our own heads or I'll meet people who are like, I'm not a teacher, but I'm like, but you are a teacher. And so thank you. I accept that.
Look at that. Nailed it. Erika will be so good at showing you how many people actually already are modeling this and practicing it without ever attaching a label to it.
I think in education, we talk so much about, I know parts of this, or this seems familiar, but good teaching and learning is good teaching and learning. And I think that a lot of these components are just what we should all be doing naturally. So let me back up here and say, when people hear about restorative practices, it's often in these kids had a conflict or this happened in my class and I need somebody to come in and fix it. Erika, do you mind talking more about what restorative practices actually is and what it looks like when it's part of the everyday learning?
Most teachers that I know, whether you're teaching in a classroom or you're teaching your kids around the house, teachers don't have to be quote unquote teachers, right? People are teaching and learning all the time. Most people I see in the role of a teacher implicitly are already restorative. And what I mean by that is that they care about relationships with students and that they are offering high levels of support and they are also expecting high levels of accountability. So when you think about restorative, what it means to be restorative, I think most people implicitly are living that out in their roles as teachers. But when we think about restorative practices and alluding to what you were inferring earlier, right, about am I doing this? Am I a practitioner? What the training provides, what the coaching provides in my role are explicit frameworks, which really supports the community so that we can have shared language and it creates a safety net with the kids too, because they're all actually getting trained in it in 6th grade in our school district through a course that I teach. One big misconception, I think one of the biggest ones is that like what you were saying, that this is like a discipline or response to conflict or harm in the community, where in fact, restorative practices should follow this idea of what we call 80-20. So 80% of the work should be proactive and upfront. So when Steph and I have our collaboration lessons, that would be an example of a proactive approach, right? We're using a restorative practices framework to teach content together. But that 80% could look like using positive, proactive, affective language, like letting kids know how you feel about the impact of the behavior, not in a negative way, but just like, I'm so proud of you for working so hard together in this great way with your classmate. Proactive circles, like little check-ins, like building social capital, where the 20 is really alluding to 20% should be responsive. Parenting in a large community, right? If you lay the framework down, then you can have the hard conversations and you can have the space for teachable moments. So what does it actually look like every day? It looks like activating student voice, asking them questions, be curious, increase sense of belonging. If a kid makes a mistake, find out what's going on instead of making a judgment so that they feel safe enough to hold themselves accountable and be able to be in the mindset to be able to look at themselves and reflect.
One of the things that you mentioned that is becoming an aha for me is that if we want to provide the conditions for students to practice these skills, we have to do that ourselves. That means, one, we need to regulate ourselves to not jump to assumptions, or we need to challenge our biases, which is in self-awareness. And being open and curious is in responsible decision-making. It's up to us to show up proficiently as best we can so that the students can have this experience as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would love to hear what you have to say about this, because you've seen it. Like, I think you've had that aha moment of, I'm already doing this and now I'm getting trained in this explicit way. And then how is it showing up for you?
I mean, every word Krista said, and Erika can back me up on this. I think every one of those words was part of our essential question for every unit this year that you came in and did a circle with us. So I was like, yes, biases we've addressed, assumptions we've addressed, being curious we've addressed. I was like, I love it so much. It's about being curious about your students and why they're in your class and why they're doing what they're doing that day and why they didn't do their work or why they did do their work or why they chose whatever avenue that they chose for that day. And it's not about being judgmental. It's about, like, hey, man, like, what led to the choices that we made today? Which is always my favorite then, too, because Erika was just in my room last week doing a circle with us on all about choices because we're doing Romeo and Juliet. So, like, this idea of curiosity being at the root, I think that it's something that so many people lead with in their lives anyways. And in working with kids, we sometimes forget that grown-ups are approaching one another with curiosity and in the workplace and things like that. And so we're just modeling it for kids. This 80-20 piece is one of my favorite things too, because, right, the language is restorative practices. And I think people get tripped up on that language being like, they're just like not going to get in trouble. And that's not what we said. We're trying to create a practice that puts restoring a relationship at the root. You can't restore a relationship that doesn't exist. So the goal is that I am being curious and I am getting to know my students and getting to know them in the context of my classroom, in the context of the content. I can't repair harm if there wasn't a relationship to fix in the first place. And I think that's where people get lost. So it's a conversation. I'm like, yeah, because if I have a relationship with somebody, I'm going to have a conversation with them about what they did. Erika's been really just crucial in me understanding that piece of it, is that it's not about having a nice convo. It's about, I respect this person, they respect me. How do I go about approaching it in that manner rather than authority? And I lost the word for that one, but like teacher and student. No, it's two people sharing the same space. How can we fix this so that we can continue to share the same space?
And I think the key really is that there is a consequence. If I get into a conflict and I did something that caused harm with someone I care about, the relational consequence is going to far outweigh any punitive consequence. So it's not without consequence. There's policies in schools. And so sometimes I come in as a support person to do restorative action planning or ask restorative questions with kids alongside something that might require them to face a consequence with administration. But I think that the high levels of support is what people think it is, but it has to also be coupled with the high levels of accountability as well.
Recently, I had some stuff happen in my classroom. I'm not impressed with what happened in here. Some kids had gone and used AI and very obviously used AI. And I'm like, I know that you didn't write this. And because I can go about it, because I spent the time building these relationships and with these students, I said, hey, man, do you want to? And he was like, there was no fighting back and forth. It was just, I did that. I'm sorry. And I was like, okay, what do we do from here? Because you've made me feel a little undervalued that you would think that this was okay. And he's like, hey, I didn't do that to undervalue you. I see what you're saying, but like, can we move on? What can I do now? And I'm like, yeah, see, it's not combative. It's not anything. And that's what she has taught me and my students so much about it. Of like, we're trying to, how do we restore this? How do I trust the student again? How does this student feel comfortable coming to me and saying, I did something, you caught me, I've made a mistake. What do we do now?
So this is reminding me of a conversation that I had with a teacher at another school. And he was expressing concern that he's glad that students have a voice, but he wonders if students have too much of a voice, that it supersedes an adult who has had training and is a professional in the classroom. And I hear that. And I think, Erika, when you said the exact phrase, that it leads to relational instability.
It's a relational consequence as opposed to a punitive consequence.
I think that is so incredibly key. And Stephanie, you just brought it up again when you used that affective statement and said, I feel undervalued. And so it's Erika, how can we have teachers shift a mindset? And I know this is a big question because shifting mindsets is hard. From students can have a voice and you can be treated as a professional. It doesn't have to be an either or. There can be an and in the middle. So I think I'll stop there.
So first of all, when I think about this question, I need to first acknowledge there is a lot on teachers' plates. So if you're a teacher listening to this and you're like, what about all the content I have to cover? And what about all the different modifications and different learning styles? That has to be said, right? There's a lot. And when I'm supporting teachers, I try to just really make it very simple, right? And also supportive. Restorative practices is not a tool in a toolbox. It's an essence of being. I already know what it's like to be a responsible adult in the room. I already know how to show up with kids. We are just now, as a community of people, sharing language so that it feels more structured and supported. Then it feels less like a pressure. I need to do this extra thing. So when we're talking about, I was listening to the story that you were telling about a teacher that was like, yeah, we want students to have a voice, but like at some point we have to also have boundaries and maintain control and all of those things. And so it had me thinking about one of the explicit practices associated with the work called FAIR process. So FAIR process, really, to keep it simple, it's 3 E's. It's engagement, it is explanation, and then it is expectation clarity. So people like to be engaged, right? If you're a stakeholder in a decision, you want to feel like you're part of it. And so people tend to buy in to whatever the decision is, even if the decision isn't what they want, if they feel like FAIR process was observed, if they were engaged, right? And so the component that makes it feel more like a buy-in is that explanation piece, right? The teacher, the administrator, whoever is the decision maker still should be making the decision. So let's say you're creating classroom norms to start off a semester and we're having this engagement period and someone says we need 15-minute breaks every class, right? So we know as the teacher, that's your voice, but we also aren't going to make the decision to take 15 minutes for you to take a break in an 80-minute block, right?
It's happened.
But there's that explanation point where you then go back to all of these things that you're explaining. Here's what we're going to do. I heard all of you. You were all heard. You were all engaged in the conversation. And now I'm going to explain the decision that I made based on all of your feedback. And this is the same thing with school board meetings, with faculty meetings, right? Like engagement matters. And then the decision makers have to make the decision considering the voices of all people and having the space to explain why the decisions were made. And then the third one's really important, that expectation clarity, right? I don't learn well or do well in spaces where I don't know the expectations. So that expectation clarity is a really important component to this FAIR process, and making those expectations visible also in the classroom is really good too. So making sure that there's engagement, explanation, expectation, clarity, right? And so when you hear that, it makes so much sense. It just creates this very structured, this is what we're doing, and that's what is providing the voice. The other thing that I think is a great way to help shift the mindset is to talk about what's called the engagement window. Engagement window of restorative practices, you'll see it for yourself. What it looks like is almost like a window with 4 panes, and it creates 4 quadrants by using 2 factors on each side of it. So there's like accountability, high to low axis, support, high to low axis, right? So if you are in that high support, high accountability zone of that, you would be in that restorative space, right? And so when you're doing things with kids, it feels restorative, right? But if you're in this high accountability, low support, it feels very punitive and it feels like you're doing things to them. which doesn't feel good for them or you, and it gets exhausting. And then that high levels of support without accountability is very enabling. It's like doing things for them. And then if there's low levels of both, they're neglectful. And so that's just a principle in the world of restorative practices called with as a guiding principle, that human beings are happier, healthier, more willing to make positive changes in their life, more productive when people do things with them rather than to them, for them, or not at all. And so those two big things, like the idea of fair process, the idea of the engagement window, I think if you can understand those, that's what really can support the shift and also support the idea that like, I do this and I might not be restorative all the time, and that's okay. It's more about awareness going into each quadrant by design and not default. And then how do we make our way back to the with if we do need to lay down the hammer sometimes, or we do need to lead it with a lot more empathy because maybe a kid's going through something and you want to be a little bit more enabling because something happened really bad in their life or they're going through a really hard day. We always are trying to get to the with. And if we have that in the forefront of our awareness, I think that is supportive in a mindset shift.
Thank you for that, Erika, because I had some ahas that I had not thought about in that way, hearing about the FAIR process. And it makes me think too about the way that we at Residence Ed look at social emotional learning, and that I'm not going to tell you, we're going to co-define what these skills look and sound like together in the class, because it is going to be different than other contexts, because there's 30 of us together here and we have some learning goals. We have social goals, and the teacher will have to oversee that, but the students get a voice in that. And so, Stephanie, I'm curious, what does FAIR process and the engagement window look like for you in your classroom? Can you think of a time where you had these conversations with students? You could go back and say, oh, yes, this is what we followed.
So frequently in the classroom, everything that Erika said is so accurate. These are the things that we were doing anyways, building relationships and doing the work up front. So when she talks about the 80-20, and she talks about this engagement window, I always think about the fact that I spend a solid amount of time in ninth grade at the beginning of the year on what might not feel like meaningful activities to other people. But I was like, we're out here modeling, like we talk about, for example, phones. And I know this won't always necessarily be a problem, but there'll always be somewhere with it, and like tech and AI. And I talk to the students very authentically at the beginning of the year. I show them, like, this is my cell phone. I said it's hot pink because I'm going to lose it, and I'm going to ask you guys to find it in the classroom. I'm sure Erika's witnessed me lose my laptop in my classroom. But like when I tell them, I was like, you don't need to have your phone. And I talk to them about what my life looks like, not too personal, but like, hey, I'm a mom of 2 kids. I am the first point of contact for the school district. So I do have to have my phone out because if they're going to try and get a hold of me very quickly, this is the first contact number they'll try. Said in the case of an emergency, if there's a real emergency, the school will be contacted. You will be got by security. You'll be out this door before you even had time to check that phone for that text message. And so we have that conversation where I'm like, hey, it's not that deep. Please respect that. However, if you think that there's a time where maybe we're allowed to listen to music, or what can we do here? I invite them into the conversation about the choices that I'm making. The one that always makes people laugh the most is I never let my students go out in the hallway to do their work. And the students are like, why can't we? And I tell them up front, I said, this has nothing to do with you. I said, you guys are wonderful. I trust you. This is about Miss Clinise and her concerns as an educator who's in charge right now. Based on my life experiences and what I've lived, I prefer you to be in the classroom. Every once in a while, I still get a handful of kids being like, can we? And I'm like, you can't. They're like, nah, it's all right. We get it. And that's it. And that's how we implement restorative practices. And when Erika was talking about this idea of common language, that's the game changer, so that we are all doing the same thing. We just don't always have the same words for it. Once we do have the same words for it, students start to understand that this is what she's saying. I know what this means. I know what this practice means. I know what it means to be in a circle. Every one of our students, Erika taught at some point and has seen in multiple roles. So she comes in and they're like, yeah, because they love her. And then they're like, yeah, all right, so we're going to do a circle. And they get it. And they know the talking piece and they know the expectations. And it just really lends itself to that, because also in the content area, we're being taught to use common language in the high school around the writing process. So it just makes sense that we would also use it around relationship behavior management and all of that. Why wouldn't we use common language in something else we're trying to teach them? And I think these two contents have to stand together. And I think they lend authority to one another when we're talking about decision making and choices in a lesson. we should talk about how decision-making and choices relates in our lives. And then now I understand why we're reading a book from however many hundreds of years ago by Shakespeare, because maybe if they'd had some of the supports that we provide teenagers now and they weren't just shut down, maybe things would look different for them.
You brought up this idea of the talking piece and the circle. I'd like to move on with that because I think that's a really important piece here. We want to have these spaces where students have a voice, but we also want to respect that they have choice. In my classroom, teaching social studies, I would always invite people to the conversation, but you weren't ever forced. Erika, we can start off with you. What are some of the ways that you've seen students be able to take ownership and be a part of the community, but also knowing that there's a circle and that they have a choice?
Yeah, so you definitely want to be intentional about the level of risk with each question. So like, how much social capital do we already have? The last time I was with Steph, we decided because it was such a tough topic, the choices we have and the limits in the choices we have, and that can get heavy. We let them show up as characters so they could feel safer to answer the question. So it's all about how you set it up. Like, how are we going to make this feel like kids can have a voice? I also think it's really important that when you set an expectation for circles, it's no different than when you're setting an expectation for classes. People get into like new things and they're like, I don't know how I'm going to do this, or it feels. It's just like how you would set an expectation for your class. And I think whenever you're setting expectations, it feels so much more relational when you tie an affective statement with an expectation. For example, I always let the kids know, I remind them every time that I'm back in a space, hey guys, I feel uncomfortable as the adult in the room when people are talking over each other because I value what everyone has to say. Because of that, the expectation is please only talk when you have the talking piece. And then every prompt should have its own framing of what's expected. So to your point, for this one, guys, I expect you to not pass because on purpose, it's just what's your favorite color? No passing on this one. But then as the risk level goes up, you would make the question non-sequential, meaning that it wouldn't go around in sequence, that you would only raise your hand to get the talking piece if you want to volunteer. There's some that are intentionally sequential. There's some that are intentionally non-sequential. Another thing that I think is really helpful is if there's a question that it's going to feel hard to jump into, we allow for another teaching strategy, right? Turn and talk with a friend, talk this through, and then we will go non-sequential. And what I'll try to do as the facilitator is I'll poke my ear around the circle, move around as they're turning talking, and pump people up. So get an ally and make them feel comfortable, confident. Hey, your idea is right on track so that they're confident in their sharing. And one more thing that I think is really important, to your point, never force a kid in. If I see a kid that's visibly not coming in, I'll say, hey, you can listen from there. And when you're ready, you can join in, and you never force it. You really don't know what kids are going through. And usually the behavior that you're seeing, the avoidance or even making a joke of the circle, usually that's rooted in fear. And so fear of not saying the right thing or fear of being in that space. So when we think of it in that way, we can look at the behavior as what it is instead of that person's not contributing and I'm taking it personal right now because I'm in charge.
And Stephanie, I saw your face light up when Erika was sharing something.
So when Erika talks about these moments for thinking time, I think it's really also important to know that she and I have put so much thought. When we had done a Romeo and Juliet circle last year, when we knew it was coming, we were like, we're going to put aside time. We're going to get together because we think we can do better this time. We want better questions, stronger connection to the content. And I remember, what was it, when we were looking through it the week before, whatever it was, we were like, all done. And then I was like, hold on, what if? Because you know how I just want to make everything the best I can. And it was like, what's the order of these questions? I think we should maybe eliminate this one. It's too close to this one. This one belongs in the turn and talk. I was like, I've got my TV with the lo-fi ambient music to turn on when they're doing their turn and talk in case they're more likely to share with someone they chose to sit next to if it's a slightly noisy environment. So much of it also stems from this whole idea of universal design of learning and like, how do we invite more people to be a part of the conversation? And so I really want to emphasize that. And that's what restorative practices is about. It's about building a place where people feel safe and they can have a conversation that might be difficult somewhere else. And yeah, it's an ELA class, so naturally it lends itself to it. Erika's also stepped in and done this with the grownups in the building. We've done it with teachers. And I know you've also been in social studies classrooms as well at the high school.
Yeah. Music, art. I'm going to meet with a math teacher. We went and did a training about how we can do it in math. We're doing it everywhere. And it can be everywhere because it's relational and relationships exist everywhere.
Especially in math, I would think they need to understand the relationships that numbers have, that formulas have. You need to know when to apply the right one. Whenever students complain about math, I'm always like, you need to treat English like math because it doesn't matter that you know what a metaphor is and how to define it. I need to know when's the right time to use it and if you can find one in the wild. Because memorizing formulas for measuring things in geometry doesn't mean anything if you don't know when to apply them. And I think these restorative circles in English and humanities is like, here's the literal application of the skills we've been talking about and how they relate to your life. And like bringing students into the conversation from start to finish. It's process over product, right?
I'm smiling because when I think about SEL, that's what I think about. Equations and numbers and math are all in relationship with each other. And so sometimes I'm a very abstract random thinker, and people who are more concrete sequential are, what are you talking about? Numbers are not the same as relationships, but I see them the same. And if I had been in a math classroom and it had been presented to me like that, I would have been on it much more quickly and it would have resonated with me. Before we move on, I want to really go back and just bring up the point that you've put in the time and the energy and the taking your expertise to really plan out these pieces. And so thinking about how can we increase engagement? Like they're in a full circle, but there's times where you can adapt it and make it small group before coming to a full circle. In elementary schools, we do read alouds as a way to put a buffer before putting the spotlight on yourself. And this is the perfect way to do that, whether it's as a scientist, a mathematician, as a historical figure. I love the talking piece too, just because I'm sitting here fidgeting with a pen. I'm a fidgeter. And so even giving kids, let them have their little squishy thing, although I take out all the noisemakers.
Agreed.
When you're talking to somebody new or about something different, or you're in a new situation, what can bring you some sense of comfort? And so you also talked about the music, and I really just wanted to highlight these pieces. And it makes me think that when I left the classroom, I was at a point where I was really starting to dig into not just winging my questions, but being really thoughtful about what I'm asking students, how I'm asking. So the next piece that I'd like to ask about is that I heard from somebody, and it made a lot of sense to me, that 80 of the proactive piece is also that you're setting up this foundation so that when you need that other 20%, there is the language, the routines, and we mess up too. And we need accountability because we're not perfect. And somebody once said to me that it helps to have that 80% positive because then the kids know that when there is a mess up, it really wasn't intentional. They're more likely to want to restore the relationship with you. So it goes both ways. And Erika, could you talk a little bit more about that, restoring a relationship, teacher to student or student to student?
Yeah, teachers and students both come to me for support. Teachers asking support with certain students they feel like they're not connecting with. Students, we realize that the harm was caused unintentionally, and we just have to have this conversation and use restorative questions to walk through what's been happening and make what restorative practices really provides is this: when there's harm caused, is that you can hold yourself accountable because the space is provided and the questions are designed to still like keep your dignity intact. When I ask every kid the question of what do most adults say when you make a mistake, I haven't heard an answer other than why'd you do that, which leads me to believe that that's what I've heard a lot as a kid or even in relationships as an adult. When you say things like what happened and what were you thinking? And what have you thought about since? And what's been hard for you? Who's been impacted and how? And what are we going to do? What can you do? What do you need? How can you show up to repair? And what do you need to feel like it's been repaired to make things right? And so when you lean into it in that way, it's actually a really good feeling to hold yourself accountable, right? If you actually can provide that space and feel like people are in that with you to support you through it, it actually is a very freeing feeling to be able to just hold yourself accountable. I find that it actually brings people closer together when you're working through that with someone. And what I always try to tell people's favorite people are the people that hold themselves accountable, because we've all been in spaces where we've been hurt by someone, whether on purpose or not, and nothing is done. And I try to frame it and spin it in that way, that if you're someone who can do that and provide that in relationships, that's a superpower. That really is a great way to show up in a relationship.
And it's a great model for the students.
We model being relational, but we also model being really big dorks in front of the kids.
Best ways to model appropriate behavior with kids is to see adults that aren't their parents interacting at work. I am the first one to be like, a teacher's like, can I come in? I'm like, yes, get in here. Erika will stop by and be like, I just need to drop that. I'm like, get in here, say hi. And I remind the kids, I was like, she's also my friend. I also just love her. And they're like, we get it. And I'm like, okay. And we usually match. So look at us today, killing it.
So I have two more questions for you. And the first one is, how do we keep this from becoming performative? Because a couple weeks ago, my niece, who's a middle schooler, got in trouble. I love her dearly. She's got a lot of spunk and personality. And she was given a piece of paper with questions to fill out. And I'm like, oh my gosh. It was like, what do you need to do? Stop talking. What do you need right now? I don't know. What do you have to do to get back to class? Apparently fill out this form. And they're working towards a reflection. She thrives on having one-to-one connection. If somebody would have come out and talked with her or spent that time, every time we push a kid out of a classroom, we're disconnecting from them. And we have to restore because they're coming back in again. And so is there a tip or something you can give us to think about how to not make this be performative and checking off a box, but truly authentic?
I think the best answer I have is that everyone's learning and growing through their whole life, especially school age kids, right? These are teachable moments. That's what it is. There's space for learning and teaching. If someone does something that's causing relational harm, it's a teachable moment. And so some of the language I use all the time is, what support do you need in meeting the expectation? Because the expectation is not going away. But if you need support, like a break, or you need to be able to go see a certain teacher, if you need to go work outside so you're not distracted, not as a punishment, if you need this to meet the expectation, let me know. And then what that does is it shifts the accountability and also power over behavior to the student, right? It's not you saying, you need to get out of the classroom because you're not X, Y, and Z. It is this relational question. What support do you need? And if a kid says, I don't need support, then I follow up with, so you're aware that you're saying you don't need support. You're not meeting the expectation. And then to Steph's point, that's making me feel blank because I'm trying to make sure that I get all of this content delivered. I'm trying to make sure that everyone feels supported. I'm trying to get through and I'm trying to teach you guys. And when this happens, I feel this. So if you don't need a support, then that's just making me feel that way. Another thing that I think is really important is that we separate the deed from the doer by saying things like, that behavior is not accepted here, but you are. And we want to make sure that we get to a space where I understand what you might need and you understand where I'm coming from so that we can work together to make this feel productive and safe for the entire class, right? So we want you here, but that behavior, it's not going to fly here. So that makes that kid feel maybe a little guilty, but not internalizing shame, right? Not like I'm a horrible kid and because I do this, I'm awful. And so I want to actually say that one of the lessons that I do in the beginning of the school year is all about that, right? So the essential question and the learning has to do with perception and persuasion. But what we do, we shift into by the end of the lesson is kids write out a perception of self statement of how they want to be seen in the school community. So then they say, I'll give the example, I want to be seen as someone who is relational, that's hardworking, that shows up, all of those things. And then the persuasion piece for them is then, what are your behaviors showing everyone? How are you persuading everyone to have the perception of you that you want? So for me, I'll be like, okay, so I behave in this way. When I say I'm going to do something, I make sure to do it. When I try to lead with curiosity instead of judgment. And then they look and they're like, that persuasion behavior, Ms. Schwanbeck, matches that part of your perception of self-statement. And so it's this idea of using these restorative concepts and frameworks. Like in the Romeo and Juliet lesson, right? We get to the point, the whole goal of this entire lesson is for them to get to the point where they think about what they need from adults to be able to invite them in to the decisions that feel really limited or tough. And we go back to the engagement window that they've already been exposed to. And we say, who's your with person? And you should expect to be treated in that way, but you should also show up in relationship in that way. And so when things feel chaotic or stressful, or you feel like you're out of options, who's going to be your with person? Who's going to be that restorative person in your life that you're willing to invite in? We get the feedback, like Ms. Clinise and Ms. Schwanbeck, we want to know what they need. And then I have a really supportive supervisor that meets with me once a week, and I'm letting him know what students are reporting out in these little tiny pockets of our district. This is what kids are saying. This is what they're reporting. And that's also how their voices are getting activated. I think that all of those real-time examples encompass some of the work that Stephanie and I get to do with each other, alluding to the question that you asked. Like, how are we making this not performative? How are we making this relational and not transactional?
And I can add my piece to it as the classroom teacher, who that 80-20 is going to show up, right? If you want to think about the 80-20, this is teachers everywhere. You can either spend 80% of the time up front, or you can spend 80% of the time after the behavior. So the way that I look at it is that I can spend 3 days at the beginning of school talking about boring facts and presenting them with low-risk questions, modeling behaviors in a way where, no, we're not talking vocab. We do this blind artist game that is absolutely hysterical. And we talk so much about communication. And I said a lot of it up front because throughout my career, and I definitely didn't know this up front when I first started, I was like, I am the teacher. They will do the listening. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to just set out some expectations. I'm going to model it. I'm going to wait because somebody's going to push a boundary in those first few days. I see it coming. I have decided in advance what my expectations are. I've laid them out. And so that first time it happens, it's not some big crash out or anything. And I'll be like, and I do oftentimes, and I invite other teachers to use the language too. I'll be like, I'm so sorry, Erika. I thought I was pretty clear about the expectation around phones. I'm super happy to go over it again. Did you have a question about it? And then they're like, please stop talking to me and asking me 18 questions. But it's changed so much my perspective in the classroom to lead with curiosity. So when instead of just being like, I've told you 15 times to put the phone away, in September, I do have that opportunity to be like, what do you need to be successful? And that's the language I try to come with for whatever the boundary being pushed is. Set an expectation. Know that a boundary will be pushed and just prepare in advance. How do I want to handle this if I acknowledge that it is likely going to happen? And prep yourself with the language. And that was mine was, hi, why were you throwing your backpack? That was like so wild to me. I'm so curious. What are we hoping to get out of this? And it's all the language that Erika's been promoting and teaching. And now it just feels so much more intrinsic and I have ownership of it. And it's so amazing to have that common language. So just that's my little piece of advice.
I appreciate that very much because we're always learning and growing. And if we prep ourselves with, okay, we know there's going to be a boundary crossed. First of all, we're working with youth, with children, but also, even if we're working with adults, boundaries will be crossed because it's human nature. And we just can't ignore things or push it under a rug. This is a way of responsibly and respectfully talking about how we can continue to have a healthy relationship. Not that everybody needs to be best friends, but we do need to keep accountability for what we do and what we say and how we show up, and then know what to do to rectify or restore that when we don't show up the way that we want to. And that work that you're doing with the students and who they want to be and how they're showing up is critical because I don't remember thinking so explicitly about that until I was in my 20s. And so we're helping them develop these skills earlier.
I just want to add this piece really quick because when we were all growing up and the people in this conversation did not have access to the information that kids do now, they're growing up a lot faster in a lot of ways. So I think it's reasonable to start introducing some social emotional intelligence at this level and start to set these expectations because they have information we need to teach. They need to learn how to move forward in life based on where they are, not where we wish they were or what they had access to. Go ahead, Erika.
And I think too that to your point, their worlds and their pace is much faster than the pace that we grew up with. And so intentionally slowing down through conversation, connection, like in restorative lessons, in collaboration with content, it's like slowing down to speed up. If you never slow down, then you're just going to be on this like almost like fast-paced gerbil wheel where you can't get off. But if you slow down and you stop it and you take that meaningful space to connect, the potential for making these connections to the content that you're learning and hearing someone else's story, knowing what other people are going through, it's a wild way to just like actually move the process forward in a way that feels more productive.
A mentor of mine, when I was going back to graduate school, told me it's like having golden handcuffs. I think of it this way, like you're slowing down because we are used to life going so fast, but you're building social capital. You're building the relationships that help when things go a little off the rails later on, because they will. It's just life. As we work on wrapping up, if people who are listening wanted to reach out to either of you, what is the best way that they could get a hold of you if they had a question about restorative practices or about what this looks like in a classroom?
Yeah, they could send me an email. I'm trying to think of the best email. Can I use my work email?
And some people prefer social media or a personal email. Your choice.
I think I'll use my Gmail. So that's eschwan12@gmail.com. So ESCHWAN12, correct, @gmail.com.
And then anybody who ever wants to get in touch with me, everything on this social medias is at Mrs. Clinise, MRSCLINISE. And then, of course, I also have a Gmail that's mrsclinise@gmail.com. It's been so fun connecting with people online. And then when I go to conferences, I'm like, we're friends on the internet, now in real life.
Oh my gosh.
I know, Erika. It's exactly what you picture.
In my classroom with both of us at the same time, we're always like, you're in for it.
They know. They're like, Ari, here they go. Both of them with the same outfits, and you're both loud. And we're like, yes.
Love it.
We're here.
We are here.
And I used to tell you, you're stuck here. I said, you always have a choice, though. You could choose not to be here. I said, but I'm happy you're here. I want you to be here.
I tell them that they are free to make any choice they want, but they're not free from this. We just went through a lot of that at class, if you can't tell.
Thank you both so much. This was so great for me because I got to hear new perspectives and to learn more pieces about restorative practices that I can put into my own work.
Thank you so
Thank you so much, Krista. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for being part of the SEL in EDU family. As you move into the rest of your day, I invite you to notice one small way social emotional learning showed up in your thinking, your relationships, or your work. Until next time, take care of yourself and keep making space for meaningful, connected learning.